This is Mike Tatarski, host of the Vietnam Weekly podcast, coming to you from Ho Chi Minh City. Countless companies around the world, including here in Vietnam, claim to be ethical or sustainable. But what does that really look like? Depending on a business's industry or place in the supply chain, behaving ethically can be extremely challenging, perhaps even impossible. Of course, that's not an excuse to avoid trying, at the very least. Sông Cái Distillery, which was founded in Vietnam in 2018 and started selling its locally sourced gin in 2019, is a prime example of a company that is inarguably striving to behave ethically across its work. It's also much more than just a distillery, as you'll learn. Today's guest is Daniel Nguyen, the founder of Sông Cái. We discussed his background in community development in the United States and rural Vietnam, Sông Kai's mission as a case study for adding value to agriculture unique to Vietnam, the relationship between ethnobotany, land value, and forest preservation, creating value for smallholder farmers through grains and botanicals not previously desired on the market, building relationships with ethnic minority communities, and much more. As always, if you have any comments, feedback, or guest ideas, get in touch at matatarski@gmail.com. Let's get to my conversation with Daniel. Daniel, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks, Mike, for having me. I'm super glad to be on this podcast with you.
Yeah, of course. So I thought we could start. I previously recorded a short introduction about Sông Cái, but maybe if you could share a bit about your personal background, how you got into this, and also Sông Cái and how that got started.
Sure. Yeah. So my name is Daniel. I'm the founder of Sông Cái Distillery. So we're a distillery, winery, or potentially you can look at it as an agricultural company based in Vietnam. So my background before starting Sông Cái Distillery is I worked in agriculture and specifically in the field of ethnobotany or agroforestry for the better part of 12 years before getting into distilling or Sông Cái Distillery specifically. And before that, my previous life in the United States was working around community development. So that's, you think of everything you'd ever want in a community, whether it be healthcare, better streets, maybe public spaces. That's everything that community development encompasses. So that's a little bit about what I did before I got to Vietnam and what I did since being in Vietnam.
Yeah, and I noticed your website mentions New Orleans East. Do you have a personal connection there, or because I'm from New Orleans?
Oh yeah, I can do that.
Yeah.
Yes, I lived out in New Orleans East, out in Michoud.
Oh yeah.
So I don't know where New Orleans you're from, but I lived out in Michoud for about 5-6 years. So that's my connection there. I did a lot of my community development work was actually out by Michoud. So for those not familiar, New Orleans is like they call it the Crescent City. It's shaped like a crescent, but you kind of have a northeastern kind of handlebar to the crescent. And at the very, very, very eastern part of that handlebar is a community called New Orleans East. And specifically in New Orleans East is a neighborhood called Michoud, or better known as Village de l'Est or Village of the East. It's the most concentrated Vietnamese population in New Orleans. Fun fact: New Orleans East is 60% of Orleans Parish landmass. Parish is like the equivalent of a county in other parts of the states.
Yeah. I'm from Lakeview, by the way. But I've noticed when I was growing up, there wasn't I wasn't really cognizant much of the Vietnamese community. But certainly when I go back and visit now, there's Vietnamese restaurants all over the place. So that's cool to see.
Absolutely. Lakeview, that was where we used to get ice cream out there all the time. Y'all had really good po' boys.
Yeah, nice. Well, it's a small world. So we don't need to talk about New Orleans too much. So and then Sông Cái, when did you start that, and how did that come to be?
Yeah, so Sông Cái, we started Sông Cái Distillery in 2018 was when it was formally incorporated. And we formally got licensed to sell commercially in the early part of 2019, so right before COVID hit. So the idea behind Sông Cái Distillery was, in essence, to create an economic case study for how we can add value to agriculture, but specifically agriculture that's native or heirloom to Vietnam. So before I did Sông Cái, like I mentioned earlier, a lot of my work was around ethnobotany and forestry in Vietnam. And specifically in Vietnam, that dealt a lot with forest land allocation. And so for those who are not familiar with Vietnam, Vietnam is a very interesting, very rapidly dynamic and developing land law and land allocation and land reform policy. Uh, the idea of public property started in 1988 with the first iteration of the land law and has been continually evolving even until present day. And a part of land law involves forest land allocation. And so, as a socialist republic, the Vietnamese government, and this is a little bit of a long-winded answer, but it's getting to where I'm going, is they decided to allocate land full free to all the citizens of the people, including in the mountainous areas for use. So my job was to go into remote mountainous villages and see essentially how land reform and forest land allocation is happening. What are the outcomes of forest land allocation, and do we need to reform the forest land allocation projects? And so my conclusion, the conclusion of my project was the 2017 Forest Protection Development law, which is I guess what you would call it's a revision to the law rather, because what we found was you can't just simply say, Daniel, Mike, here's like 50 hectares each. That's not really equitable land distribution. All land is not created equal. So it's really much
Mhm.
more nuanced than that. And why ethnobotany comes into this is because a lot of the way that we as humans, dictate what land is valuable is essentially our connection to the botany that's grown on that land, or what kind of um, fauna or botanicals or trees or even grains that are grown or natural resources on that land, for example. That changes how we view the value of that land and how it's going to be brought into our um, land allocation or land management policy. So that was a lot of essentially what ethnobotany is looking what kind of plants are valuable, not only in economics, but then also in terms of spirituality and cultural factors to communities, and what poses them to have more value to the land, or add value to the land. And so what we found was the reason why Sông Cái Distillery came about was once you allocate land to people, give land to people, give them a deed and whatnot, is that enough? And the answer, my hypothesis was no. And I think a lot of the people I was working with had the same conclusion: is once you allocate land to somebody, and it's again, United States, we went through this about a couple hundred years ago with the Homestead Act and whatnot. There's a lot of differences in how these things were enacted in terms of historical context. However, one of the things was once you give someone land, they need to have a way to make a living off that land. If not, that land is really useless. And so we started off with spice trade, and spice trade is really difficult to enact any change or economic change in a person's life. And so we decided one day we were distilling corn in Simacai, which is a very remote part next to China in the Lao Cai province, which is northwest of Vietnam. That alcohol is actually a natural end result of agriculture. Once you have enough surplus and the technology to create fermentation, but then from fermentation spirits, that you now are creating essentially innumerous value to your agricultural goods, not only just a way of storage, but also other ways to derive value or pleasure from your agricultural goods. So we thought alcohol actually might be a very good solution to this, and that's what started Sông Cái Distillery, was a way to let's take all the native grains or all these botanicals that people find value that are not intrinsically economic in terms of this current market situation. How do we create economics out of it by creating a brand, a vertically integrated brand, through the use of alcohol? And that's how Sông Cái started.
Yeah, I was going to ask what ethnobotany is, but you kind of just described that. But maybe another vocabulary word, you mentioned botanicals. Now, I know if you go to like a fancy cocktail bar, you may see that in some of the descriptions. What are botanicals exactly?
Botanicals are just plants. So plants are really, that can encompass grains, it can encompass herbs, it can encompass trees, barks, flowers, fruits, for example. It's all under the realm of botany and botanicals. So botany is a study of botanicals, essentially.
Okay.
And so yeah, botanicals are just a fancy word for plants. That's essentially what it is.
Okay. Okay. So given your background, this kind of makes sense now. But in looking at Songkai's website, it talks about environmental degradation and biodiversity loss, which I don't spend a lot of time reading the websites of food or drink companies, but I'm guessing most don't talk about that. So what impact do those issues have on your work or these fields more broadly?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that environmental degradation has a lot of impact. So, for example, environmental degradation will eventually lead to degradation and loss of biodiversity, which you mentioned. And what we're intrinsically, as a company, interested in is biodiversity, because we're looking at native or heirloom botanicals that may not have commercial value unless we assign value to it. When you lose biodiversity, one of the big risks that we have is if it's not well documented, it can very well be lost forever.
Mm,
It also degrades the kind of resilience potential of a community. So, say for example, one of the great tragedies that hit in Vietnam actually in very recent history was African swine fever, flu, and that wiped
mhm,
out a huge swath of the swine population in Vietnam because we were basically essentially monocropping pork. And if everyone's got the same immune system, it just takes one, disease to wipe us all out, essentially. And what we found is greater biodiversity not only increases the resilience of our ecosystem and our food chain or our food security, but it also stabilizes the environment as well. If you look at Super Typhoon Yagi recently, actually, um, I don't know if you know this, but per capita and per square kilometer, so per square area, Vietnam is actually top 10 in the world for landslide incidences. It's actually ranked 8th or ninth. So it's actually very, very shocking in terms of when we decrease biodiversity, what that generally means is there's an increase in intensive and extensive agriculture. Intensive means you're really working the land really hard. Extensive means you're expanding the amount of footprint of that agriculture is working on, and what that generally means is you're degrading forest, and when you degrade forest, there's nothing to prevent erosion. And so I don't know if I think, are you in Saigon or Ho Chi Minh City?
yeah, I'm in Ho Chi Minh City.
Yeah, so you might have seen the videos or images, but the flooding. I mean, I live in Hanoi, and I could see the water coming all the way up to the foot of Long Bien Bridge, which is absolutely insane. So I think like one of the things that we see is that loss of biodiversity is always tied to ecosystem services and ecosystem well being. So we're a lot of the extrinsic benefit of targeting a bigger swath of biodiversity is you intrinsically have to preserve the integrity of the forest. A lot of the botanicals we use, or a lot of plants that we use, for example, we purposely take plants that are intrinsically tied to the ecosystem. So, say for example, sangentheme is a type of rhizome that we use. It does not grow under direct sunlight, so therefore it must grow under a canopy of trees. So you can't just monocrop it out in the sunlight. So these are the ways that we're trying to promote not only, economic development for the communities, but then also some sort of integrity of the ecosystems that we're working in.
And I mean, a good lead in. You mentioned the communities. Now, I think you mentioned Lao Cai. That's a lot of ethnic minority communities up there, and I think you work with a lot of Hmong and other types of villages, and for lack of a better word, up there. Why work with those communities, and how do you kind of build? How have you built those relationships over time?
Yeah, I think like one of the reasons there are multiple reasons why we work with mostly ethnic minority groups, and I think one of the very fundamentally easy questions was that it was a relationship I already had. It was a lot of the working relationships I already had from the forest land allocation work that I was doing. So the people that we work with have already a mindset of conservation and the importance of biodiversity. The second reason why we work with ethnic minority communities is because in the group of people that I had worked with, the cohort of people I'd worked with before, there are lowland farmers. One of the problems with lowland farmers is you have greater proximity to the trading markets, to the market in general. When you're accessing communities, when we're talking about communities that are generally living above the elevation of 1,500 meters, they are generally what you call Vung Seo Vung Sa, which is kind of like a little bit isolated and remote
Mhm.
and have difficulty accessing the market. So, for example, a lot of major, I guess, investment or other economic poles aren't competing with you. So you're going into these areas and you're really going the effort. And there's a lot. It's a double edged sword. So for example, we've had to run in the last 2 years running water, things like that to these communities, which is fine because I think like one of the things is we get to have the opportunity to have to dictate or help dictate some of the development pathways of certain these communities. So say for example, corn is a huge issue because corn is an open pollinated variety of crop. What that means is if like a dandelion or I don't know what you call that, like yeah, like a dandelion. If you kick a dandelion, you can see like the seeds dispersing, right? Imagine that
Sure. Yeah.
if you have one hybrid seed or variety in there or like a GMO crop in there and it just like blows in the wind, it will infect the entire valley, for example. So when we're talking about preserving biodiversity, it's a really sensitive topic because it just takes one or two bad introductions, and you can completely alter the pathway of an ecosystem forever. And we've seen that happen numerous times. So we have to go to the most remote villages to try and not only preserve but then develop the biodiversity. It's much easier to do that than to restore. Restoration is very time consuming and then costly in terms of resources.
And are these, I mean, I imagine they must be, but are these communities pretty receptive to, I mean, again, I know you had a pre existing relationship, but of course they're very familiar with the land and the challenges of it. And I guess these, unique botanicals and things like that, but what's their response to this approach?
Yeah, the communities that we've been fortunate to work with in Lao Cai and Dien Bien, or even in Kon Tum and Tinh Nguyen, like the Central Highlands, are receptive. I think one of the issues is more of like, how do we effectively overcome each obstacle in each locality? Every single locality has its own obstacles, and are we able to overcome? And generally, that's the biggest issue, is if we're able to overcome or not. So I think reception is one, but then the ability to overcome obstacles and reach levels of success with each other is a whole nother ballgame.
Yeah, and I guess on that front, I mean, your website also talks about sustainable harvesting and cultivating practices pursued with the farmers. I mean, what do some of those practices look like?
Yeah, so so for example, in one of the villages that we work with in Lao Cai, one of the things that we do is we do a lot of seed saving. So we work with the National University, or the National Institute of Agriculture in Hanoi. And what we do is we initially, in certain villages, will collect seeds and we'll bring them back and re-propagate them with the help of the university, and then provide the seeds back to the community. What we do now is the communities have their own seed gardens or seed nurseries, greenhouses in the villages, where they're actually actively engaged in that. Um, and so what that is we're trying to make sure that we don't over harvest one in the forest. So we're always trying to keep track of the amount of biomass that we're moving. The second is that we're always actively saving and then repropagating and then regrowing some of those seeds back in the forest, to ensure that there is a positive regeneration. And it's not only just the crops that we're growing, but then it's also all types of crops, because you don't really know, essentially, like, if you're just going to push the selective selection of one, it's going to cause a little bit of a skew in the ecosystem, for example. So we do need to repropagate, like, just like whatever we can find in that vicinity. And so that's one of the ways that we're working with the community, is seed gardens, seed collection, propagation, then reintroduction back, and then expanding the footprint of forests, or of the areas that we're harvesting from.
And you kind of mentioned at the start that, with the Song Kai kind of was born out of realizing that alcohol can be a byproduct of some of these crops. But why? I guess why gin? I mean, I know you don't only make gin, but I think that's what I know your business best as. That's not really like an indigenous liquor to Vietnam. I don't know if indigenous is the right word, but why that one?
I think for us, it was a business strategy. So I think it's speaking a language that's common enough globally, where we can talk, where people can understand the language that we're speaking. I think for us, gin, one, was it understood globally. People understand what gin is, how to use it, how to consume it. But then gin was a product that's flexible enough in terms of definition, that allowed us to not only be called a gin, but then also to use that as a palette to basically insert all these native or heirloom or native or heirloom Vietnamese ingredients. And so we're really fortunate that gin allows us that kind of flexibility. So other than being called a gin, all the ingredients other than the juniper in our products is entirely sourced from Vietnam, and native and heirloom where possible.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I mean, I know you make other products as well. Is that just a matter of coming across a different type of botanical, or trying to get into a new community and wanting to try something new, or how does that work?
And so this is a part of the long term vision of Sông Cái. So once you get your foot in the door with gin, and something that people understand, you build a little bit of a brand standing, or equity, if you will. People are more willing to listen to other things that you're introducing. And so all the other products that we're making, whether it be rice wine, or whether it be an Amaro bitters in the style of the Red Zao, or even recently we released a single malt whiskey that's made entirely from indigenous grains and fermentation practices. All these start to stray further and further away from your kind of regular or ordinary lexicon or vocabulary in terms of the drink world. And so it's hard. Well, at the end of the day, we're a for-profit business. We need to keep the lights on, and gin allows us to do that, and allows us to reinvest in the communities, but then also do all these things that are more native to Vietnam, and then talk about, for example, native fermentation practices in Vietnam through our rice wine, distillation practices that are native to Vietnam through our whiskey, or medicinal botany that's native to Vietnam through the Amaro bitters. And so all those things do not sell as much volume as gin. And so these things are kind of subsidized a little bit through our gin. I mean, they make their own money, but they're not, by any means, not allowing us to get to the scale that we are. So that's essentially the relationship that we have in terms of developing our portfolio is the long-term vision is we've got things that are more palatable or more recognizable on the global side. But if you are willing to go, ride or die with us, we've got all these other ingredients, or products that will, you know, shed light on fermentation, distillation, or even medicinal botany practices that might be maybe less approachable to the mainstream.
And you mentioned investing in the communities. I mean, earlier in the conversation, you talked about having to run water into a couple areas. But what does that look like? I mean, is that you operating in an area for a while and being like, hey, we noticed you don't have this, or do people you're working with come to you, or what's that process like?
Yeah, so it's a process that's in the works, but right now our current iteration is the way that we work in community has several steps. So the first step is usually generally like a very simple buyer and supplier relationship where we're just sourcing from the community at a price that's negotiated fairly between the two parties. And then once we've gained a little bit of a repertoire, what we'll do is we'll start investing in infrastructure. So whether it be a legal infrastructure that will help them incorporate a company or cooperative, maybe lay the means in order to get certifications. So for example, if you need food safety certification, you do need running water. So we can help invest in that, for example. And the third iteration, which is the final and the most updated iteration, is equity share. So our May, Amaro Bitters, is actually an equity share product. So we own part of that brand with the Red Zao community that we're working with. So they actually have equity that's been recognized by the United States as a co-owner of that brand. So that's, again, once you get to that level, no longer are they just supplying you with botanicals, but they're actually partners making decisions. We make budgetary decisions all the time. And we look at, our P&L, what are we making off the product? What do we want to do with the profits? So say, for example, this past year, both us and the partners, Red Zao partners, decided to reinvest that entirely into the construction of 3 more seed nurseries in the Sông region to support the reforestation efforts, for example. So these are the ways that we invest in communities. And ultimately, we want to replicate that model where we have more communities coming on as equity partners in terms of moving up the supply chain, if you will, with our brand.
Yeah, and I was going to ask, I mean, kind of, so obviously you've been around for a few years now. You have relationships in several provinces. Do you have people, communities in other provinces coming to you and being like, hey, we've heard about this, we want to work with you? How does that kind of, if that's happening, how does that kind of change some of your approaches to what you've been talking about in terms of practices?
Yeah, we do have people who approach us actually quite frequently. I think at this point with our capacity, we are not able to take on additional communities. I mean, there's certain botanicals where we are looking at ways to expand production. So say, for example, native corn production. It doesn't make sense for us to expand just corn production in the mountainous regions, like Swidden agriculture is what they call it. But we are looking at perhaps moving this down to lowlands because that's more suited to more intensive and extensive cultivation practices. So we're trying to explore what does that look like while still maintaining our sustainability approach. But as of right now, our community development arm is just we're taxed. Like I think we're in 3 provinces actively right now. We're potentially maybe adding on a 4th, but every single locality that we add on, it's we have to dedicate. So for example, we have 4 full-time staff members who are dedicated to just community development. They're in and out of the villages almost on a daily basis to try to make sure that, because again, like we mentioned, the relationship evolves very quickly from just supplier and buyer to we are now engaged in community development, like infrastructure development, legal development, and then human capacity so that we can get to the point where people can become shareholders, essentially.
And I mean, what are some of the challenges I guess maybe you face in working with the communities, and then in terms of supply, I guess for lack of a better word? I mean, it must be said that a lot of the time these mountain communities are impoverished. I mean, these are not easy places to live. I just was reading an article the other day about how, the northern mountains, there's still a lot of people who want to migrate to Ho Chi Minh City, Binyang, or the Red River Delta where the manufacturing is. Yeah. So, I mean, are there, especially with these kind of like heirloom crops where I suppose that's like passed down from generation to generation, is there an issue with younger generations not being interested?
Yeah, I think that issue specifically is an economics issue. If you can solve that with economics, then there's the migration. Migration is always going to happen. I think there's always a degree of migration, and migration in itself is not bad because it allows for cross
No.
pollination of ideas and whatnot. I think that in terms of how do we keep people in villages, you do need to add value to what people have naturally in the villages. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about heirloom varieties is what we that ends up translating to is we end up paying a lot more for corn, for rice, or for all the botanicals than we would if we just went with commercially available, like SC25, for example, is much cheaper than the rice that we're buying, or the corn that's used for feed. Yeah, I think Vietnam right now has like 5 GMO varieties that's licensed, and they are literally, I think, a seventh of the price of what we're buying corn for. So we're paying 7 times. Well, so these things that we end up doing, but I think like we're basically internalizing extrinsic costs to our business, which is fine. And I think it adds to the story and the value of our product. And we try and communicate that as much as we can. That these costs they are out there in the world, but they're externalized, and whether we're trying to internalize it as a supply chain essentially. Whether or not that's a smart business decision, I mean, it's in terms of economics, it does translate into these, I guess, what you call intangible value. So it's in terms of the branding, value based consumers and people who are not just there for the taste, but they're also there for the story, and that really adds to that.
Yeah, I mean, that was going to be one of my questions. Is if there's somebody listening by chance who wants to maybe start a business like this, that's more socially responsible, engaging with the community. I'm sure it's not easy. But what advice would you give? But I mean, let's say specifically for Vietnam, I guess.
I think it's a marathon. It's a long game. I think one of the things that I learned a lot in terms of working in Vietnam versus in New Orleans, for example, is in Vietnam you are literally on your own. So say for example in the US, like my work in New Orleans East, a lot of these kinds of work that we would be doing in the community would be subsidized by the government in terms of grants, in terms of, donations and 501(c)(3)s and things like that. Whereas in Vietnam, there's none of that. So you really have to understand that it's a marathon, and you need to have a very clear understanding of finances and economics. Because if you don't make money, you can't help the community. And I think that's one of the things that, yeah, and I think in that sense, you need to be very clear. Are you a charity or are you a business? And I think that's one of the hardest things that we struggle with on a day to day basis is we need to make sure we keep the lights on. We pay all of our staff, and we're growing so we can help more people. But that means that a lot of my time I have to be doing the non-fun stuff of accounting, finances, financial projections, making sure the company is keeping the lights on. And then essentially you hire out and divvy out the fun stuff to the staff, and that's fine. I think that's really all about executing the mission. I just would say just be mindful. It's a marathon, and as in any marathon, there's always going to be pain. I think the marathoners. I used to run marathons, but um, in marathon training, we're taught that it's not a question of if there's going to be pain, it's only when and then how you're going to deal with it. So you just know that there will be a lot of pain, hardships, and trials and tribulations. So
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah, that absolutely. Well, so I mean, again, it's a marathon. I mean, you've been at it for a little while now, but what do you kind of hope to achieve? What are your goals, I guess, kind of in the next couple of years or something like that?
So our hope in the next couple of years is we're continually expanding the reach of our gin portfolio, and with that comes with all the other products. So we're trying to expand the amount of markets that all the rest of our products are in. So the rice wine, the Amaro bitters, the single malt whiskey, our whiskey lines, and our brandies. Um, and so that's one aspect. The other aspect is I would want to replicate the model of the May Amaro bitters some more. So, for example, that product again, the Red Zow communities are part shareholders in that brand, and I would like in the near future to be able to expand products like that. So, say for example, I'd like to have 2 to 3 other products where communities are also part owners of that, so that we can start to say, hey, this is an actual replicable economic development model that's not just working in Vietnam, but I think that I could say that this could be something that could be replicated in the West, for example. Because I think there's a lot of talk about sustainable businesses and ethical businesses, but really at the end of the day, are we moving people that we're working with higher up in the supply chain? And I think that's one of the easiest ways to do that is give people real meaningful equity share. And that's what we're trying to prove.
Oh, and maybe one final question that just popped into my head. But the farmers you work with, I mean, they, I guess for context, I mean, you would know more about this than me, but for people who don't know, Vietnam is like very smallholder farm based. So people have very small plots of
Yes.
land. Are they only growing for you guys, or do they have other crops growing as well generally?
That's a really good question. So it depends. So for example, a lot of our grain farmers are pretty much growing only for us. And we are essentially buying like communes out at a time. So for people who are not from Vietnam, so it goes from province to district to commune level. So that's essentially like state to city to like neighborhood, I guess. So you're buying out essentially entire neighborhoods worth of products, and that's how many people are actively involved in the cultivation of something that's high volume like grains, whether it's for but say for example it's for other maybe less volume botanicals. And I think a better gauge would be they're not essentially growing it full time for us, but they're managing. We've got people who are managing it full time for us. So say for example, there's not enough seasonal botanicals to require year round work. But say for example, when the season comes, then people will be all hands on deck for that.
Cool. Well, I know you're a busy guy, so I appreciate you taking some time to talk to me. Really fascinating approach to your business that obviously there's kind of convergence of a lot of really big issues for Vietnam and other country, every country really. But anyway, Daniel, I really appreciate you taking some time to talk to me today.
Absolutely. Thanks, Mike, and thanks for having me here. And yeah, hopefully we can have another conversation soon.
That's it for this episode of the Vietnam Weekly podcast. Connect with Vietnam Weekly on Threads, LinkedIn, or Instagram. Thank you so much for listening. Please rate or review the show on your preferred podcast platform, and see you next week.